Again, I am joined by my colleagues Kell Delaney and Scott Spann. I am Robin Anselmi. Welcome to today's community gathering, From Chaos to Clarity, Hearing the Music in the Noise. Kell, you want to say a couple things about housekeeping just to get us kicked off?
Yes, sure. So I will be monitoring the chat alongside the conversation. I'll pop in periodically to the conversation. But when you're in the chat, please select all panelists and attendees and share your comments, your questions. To the best of my ability, I will link relevant questions to the conversation. I'll ask them of the group. We won't necessarily get to them all, but also I encourage you to use the all panelists and attendees option, because often your co-attendees have some really fascinating, interesting things to share as well. Yeah, and this is being recorded. So at the end, you will receive the link to the recording, and you can share that with friends as well if you think it's relevant to someone you know.
Great. And because I asked everybody else where they're joining us from, Keller, where are you calling in from today? Where are you?
I am in Boulder, Colorado.
And Scott, where are you? Everybody always wants to know where you are.
Well, I'm where I usually am when I'm doing this is from my home office 42-foot sailboat in Sausalito, California. It's a lovely place to live and work.
Fabulous. Well, again, today's topic is From Chaos to Clarity, Hearing the Music and the Noise. We thought it was a particularly relevant topic given the volatile, unpredictable times we find ourselves in. So Scott, the thing that's on my mind as we get started today is, in the midst of times that are volatile, unpredictable, unreliable in terms of past patterns and where things are going, I noticed that in lots of organizations, people make strategic moves that they think make great logical sense, that they've thought through, that they put a lot of effort behind, and they still do not quite turn out the way they thought they would. Mm-hmm. For you, what explains that? Why do people make what are really smart, logical moves, and yet we don't get the results we think we're going to get?
Well, there's usually one of two reasons. Some leaders that I've worked with, there's just a lot of moving parts, and what might appear to you in the moment as like the most important or the biggest opportunity part is just one part of a whole, and you're not fully aware of the implications it's going to have across the system as a whole or across the organization as a whole. That's one reason. And so just getting that stabilized, where you can think, where you really can think through it bit by bit and go, oh, now I understand. That's very, very helpful. The second reason is often there are many leaders I've worked with that they do have their head around the whole thing. I mean, they just like, my God, how do you hold that much stuff in your head at one time? And then I'll ask them, well, does Tom have that same? And does Sally have that same? And Wong and so forth. And they're like, well, no, they've got 40% and they have 30%. And it's like, oh, well, then how do you guys ever make an aligned execution on this thing you have in your head? So the importance of being able to get the team, the organization, well, at least the leadership team, aligned around a common frame of reference, from which to then execute, and also as a standard by which to, sort of check yourself as you move forward, is the second. And I would actually say it's the most common, because many times people are the leader of an organization because they can get the whole thing in their head. But then translating that and causing the conversations to deepen that understanding to the level that people are actually able to execute from that and begin to like riff off of that is a whole other level, which is one of the reasons I love working with, Conversant, because we go deep on conversation when we work with you. So, yeah.
Well, and getting to that point of common understanding, like that's a really, like that sounds so simple, like, okay, great, common understanding, great, do that, handled. Talk a little bit about, like, for you, what does it actually take to get to the level of common understanding that's required to make some of the kinds of shifts you've seen possible in organizations? And then I want to talk about what are some of those things that you've seen possible in organizations.
Sure. So I think, one of the learnings that has been really valuable for me, first I was doing it unconsciously, and then because I learned more, I started doing it consciously, was that the solutions in complex adaptive environments are emergent. It's unlike, where there's high certainty and high predictability and low rates of change, where you can build a structure and then you can follow that structure and it generally works, like a factory floor or even, a refinery or whatever. But in a complex adaptive environment, the dynamics are so rapid, and I mean, we're living in it right now, that the solutions actually have to emerge kind of from the ecosystem itself. So the way we typically do that is we go around inside of an organization and we kind of do a 360 of what are you trying to cause, for whom or what or where, and what's required for you to be successful. And tell me that based on your favorite success story, so that we know, like, what are you truly capable of? And does this really work? Or is it not some fantasy? And then tell me that story. And then we literally describe that as a small, like, microsystem and reflect it back to the leader. And they go like, oh my God, you know, like, that's exactly what I do. But it's often like novel to them. It's surprising how something they thought was almost impossible to describe, you know, can be captured on a single page in a fairly straightforward language. And so then that surprise to them then multiplies across the 360 of, say, the leadership team. And then if you can imagine, we take all of those and then we say, okay, these all have to fit together inside of this organization. When they do, what does that look like? And then we integrate those things, and then and that gives us that shared view. We walk everybody through that. That's what actually really holds the conversation, is because we can go bit by bit through that and say, oh, this is how it works. And it's amazing how many times, you know, we've come to almost like loggerheads about, you know, like, well, it doesn't work like that. Yes, it does. And then they talk it through and go, oh, this is how it actually works. And it's just stunning how many people don't understand, you know, because it's very complex. I mean, that's why I have a job. How many people don't understand how the thing actually functions, almost like the math of a situation. Is that helpful, or am I?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that occurs to me that we say often to leaders that I think you're doing at a highly sophisticated, much more detailed level, even than what we suggest to leaders, is making their implicit thinking explicit to others, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a lot of what you're talking about, is like, how do we actually do that in a much more tangible way so that people can actually see my thinking, Kell's thinking, your thinking about how work gets done, and all of the places where our thinking both combines to be more powerful together, and where our thinking actually gets in the way of each other, right? Where I have something about how I think a problem is being solved that's different than Kell's, that we haven't actually talked about because it's not been made explicit. Kell, what were you going to add?
I just want to double down on a particular point, because I think it's implicit, but I want to make it clear too that, you know, we name this from chaos to clarity. And as we all are tackling more and more chaotic or challenging or unpredictable problems, it's actually our network of people who have all the wisdom. What Scott is describing is the ability, every single person, if you accessed everybody in your organization, their perspectives and what they're seeing amongst that chaos actually has a more comprehensive view of the picture. And so if you think about traditional leadership, where there's more of a hierarchy, often those people are just missing some of the important information in the chaos. And so this process is welcoming in the different perspectives, creating the environment and the trust where people feel welcome and want to contribute their perspectives. And then Scott does a brilliant job of bringing all that together and connecting the dots, so that then they can step back and see their collective view together. And it's that community where we're the strongest and wisest.
Well, I want to add to that, Kell, by saying that, and I don't want people to get the impression that we just take whatever anybody says and throw it in the pot. Not that you meant that at all, but there's a math to this. There's a methodology to it that checks what people say. And so there's a rigor, so that you can't just say anything you want to say and have that like fit inside the thing. And so we describe that very rigorously, and then everybody goes through it and double checks that, so that when we come out the back end, we do have literally a shared view. We are aligned around a shared view of reality, and that's what then enables us to take action. And typically, you know, through an analysis, high leverage action, and that's what then enables that execution that I talked about in response to your first question, Robin, about like, it's the execution often where that thing breaks down. And so you've got to get that alignment up front.
Scott, you know, we're talking about this and it sounds all very logical, right? Like, you analyze this story and you analyze that story and you come up with like, here's how all that works together. Can you say a little bit, and Kell, this is for you as well, like, and I see there's a bunch of people from Loud Ornithology, you may comment in the chat at the same time. How does it feel when you're actually going through this process? Like, what is the human emotional component of what actually happens when people are sort of in this together? I'd love to just hear, because I think, again, this makes us all sound very logical, and I have a feeling there's more to that story.
There is. And I've had to learn about that over time. We used to just take this complex map, which sometimes has as many as 150 elements on it, and throw it up on the screen. And the audience would just glass over. It'd be like, oh my God, like what? I think it was commonly called the spaghetti bowl was the common name given to it. So I've had to learn, it's like learning a new language, right? It's like learning to play the piano or learning to, hit a golf ball or whatever, analogy you want to use. You have to titrate people into it. So the first titration is interview an individual, show them a little micro world. Don't even use the word systems thinking, just walk them through their little micro world. And they go, oh, I get it, and then they're ready for the next step. And then even when we go to the big step, we usually go to just we literally, have developed a way to unveil it like, okay, is this true? Is this, and we're not even showing the whole thing. We're just showing a piece and then a piece, because it's a very different way of thinking. And it actually has a visceral component, which I think is what you're trying to get to, a visceral component of the temptation to to deny the complexity of reality and to try to go to a simple heuristic to handle it, which inevitably fails. So that ability to let people's nervous systems, in a sense, catch up with the true complexity of their reality and the way that they're able to actually internalize it and begin to act on it. So we do that, in very, very carefully titrated, distilled bits. Although I say that from my side of the equation, Kell's been in many cases on the other side of the equation when it gets unveiled, and he hasn't seen it before. So Kell, feel free to be as raw and authentic about your own sense of a spaghetti bowl as you want.
It's incredibly overwhelming, and every time I've seen it, my first response is to run away. I've watched groups, I've participated in it, and I've learned to trust that our innate ability to connect and have compassion to one another will, if fostered, will break through. It's almost like we all come into these conversations with our perspective, and we're very in it because we're in it all the time and we care deeply. But when that starts to break apart and we're willing to just listen a little, hear a little bit of what other people have to say, the breaking apart is the hard part, because it's this deconstruction of your own way of working and what you think works and how you've, for me, like how I felt valid and I contributed in a way that I could see. But then you start to hear and understand that, oh, Robin has a perspective that really opens my eyes to things that make me even more valuable or makes my contribution more significant. And you can watch that with a group. It can take a long time, but every single situation, they come out the other end and there's this cathartic joy almost, and deep connection and friendship that then lays the groundwork for future work together.
Because I think so often when we're talking about this, we're really looking at interdependencies, right? So interdependencies that haven't been looked at before, that there have been assumptions made about how those interdependencies work. So I might assume one thing, Kell might assume another, and that putting it out on paper in a way challenges our way of thinking about how the world works, right? And so we're actually being challenged to rethink how we think A plus B and what that equals. Because often, we've gone 1 + 1 = 2, and it really doesn't, right? And the map actually, when we start to do mapping and really putting all of those relational components onto paper where people can see, oh, sometimes 1 + 1 = -10, right? Because we put two things together that are actually impacting each other in a negative way. And we haven't even noticed it. One of the things I think that's fascinating, and I'd love for both of you to comment on this, we often say this, you're getting the results exactly as the system is designed. So like, if you're not getting what you want to get, it's because the system that you're working inside of is actually designed to get exactly where you're landing. So Scott, you or Kell, can you just comment on that a little bit? Like, so when people aren't getting what they would expect, how does the map actually help them with that?
Well, you're right. And the analogy I often use is that of like the human body. Sometimes the system is, because people thought through the design of the system to produce an outcome. and they didn't necessarily misthink the design of the system. But if I think about it like the human body, I'm a highly competitive athlete. And so this body could either lie on the couch, and train for watching TV, or this body can be trained for, a marathon or a tournament or whatever I wanted to do. So it's not necessarily that the whole system has to radically change somehow. It's merely the way that we've weighted certain resources inside the system. And so understanding how our system has been, how it's operating, and there may be design flaws in the system. We may go like, wait a minute, these 3 things don't cause that to happen. There's something, lots of people do those 3 things and this doesn't come out. What's the thing that we, that we're either implicitly doing or not doing that would cause that outcome? So, but it creates the ability to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think, Robin, to build on what you said a moment ago about the interdependencies, this whole thing really is about relationship, which again is part of why my Conversant relationship with you all has been so fruitful, is that, it's relationship to self. Am I clear about what I'm trying to cause and how that happens? It's relationship to another, which all of a sudden I realize, oh, you're not the idiot I thought you were. You're really trying to, what you're thinking makes a lot of sense on its own, but then there's ultimately, and this is what I think Kell was talking to about overwhelming, is it's the relationship with reality, because reality becomes the ultimate arbiter about whether or not what we're doing works or doesn't work. And that is something that we seem to avoid as a species again and again and again, is just, how do we get into intimate relationship with ourselves, with one another, and with reality itself? And through that, we're able to assess whether or not the system that we've got, whether it's in the design or the way we've weighted the different aspects of the system, are sufficient to the task. And I'll stop there and let Kell jump in.
Scott, I think he's had a very comprehensive and good answer. The couple of pieces I would ask, or I would add, I love this analogy of the body that you always use, because organizations are living bodies, living systems, same exact thing. And this idea that the system is operating exactly as it was designed, I think it's important to acknowledge and to have a little bit of appreciation for. And that design has worked really well for us up to this point. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And like Robin said at the beginning of this call, if we find that we're not getting the outcomes we're trying to get, that is just a little red flag that, oh, okay, the system is no longer serving that. It's like Scott's idea of, you can't just get up off the couch and run the marathon. You're not going to get the outcome you set out to get. But what I love about the same concept is it gives you something to do. The design is not causing the outcomes you wish. You can change the design, and that is something you can get in together. And that is what Scott has talked about a little bit earlier with the mapping and the way you bring together the conversations and that information. So you start to see, well, what is the current design? What is the design that's needed? And collectively, how are we going to create that?
Scott, I'd love if you would share. So like we've talked about like the importance of all the conversations and really understanding all those intricacies, how we're making people's implicit thinking explicit and really looking at how does that all come together. You've also mentioned sort of in passing, but I'd love an example of sort of the surprise on the other side of it. So do you have an example that would readily come to mind that people could wrap their heads around of, a place where people thought a system was working one way, by actually doing this analysis, they saw a different way of being or a different way of operating that actually would produce the results they were looking for? Do you have an example that comes to mind?
I do actually. So there was work we did with the supply chain early on in our relationship. By that I mean Conversant and I. And it's the one in which they said, when we proposed what we were going to do, they said it's impossible. Nobody can do that, and our response was, unbidden, fine, we'll do it for free. Pay us if we succeed, and it's like, whoa. And it's like, well, if we think we can do it, like, we should take the risk.
Pause there for just one moment. To anybody that's on the line, we are not doing work for free. Just want to be very cautious there for a moment. We do.
That's what's called a loss leader back in the day. It's not a repeat offer. Yeah. So we did that. We went. We interviewed the 360. We modeled the system. It was an overwhelming system. It took us 2 to 3 hours to go through it. Everybody learned from it. And so some of the surprises that came out of it, so this was a computer manufacturer, and one big surprise was on the very tail end of the map, which is on the logistics end, where they're shipping stuff off to Chase Bank or to, you know, the federal government or whatever, the finished laptops. What would happen would be that sales, you know, early, before the year even began, would make a forecast about this is how many we're going to sell. And they're doing it in good faith. You know, they're like, we don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, so here's our best guess. And then they would do what they should do, which is they exceed their target. Well, meanwhile, shipping has purchased containers a year in advance to minimize the cost of shipping. Then they're surprised, you know, suddenly, you know, way through the year, they've already used up all their container space, and now they've got to buy container space on the spot market. Well, they're either going to disappoint Chase Bank, who's a big customer. I'm making Chase up in this case, but they're going to disappoint the customer, or they're going to blow their margins in a high margin. I mean, in a, you know, like a low margin, very competitive environment. And so they end up holding the bag. And they look like the problem, but they're not the problem. The problem was way up in the beginning when we were forecasting what's going to happen. So that's one example. Another example was in the original design manufacture in the plants in Shanghai. Marketing, of course, wanted like, hey, you can have any color you want. You know, we're not talking about black. We're like, you can have any color you want, and you can have it with this configuration and da da da. Well, what they didn't realize was when you go through the ODM process, the original design manufacture process, if there's a breakdown in the line, if something doesn't work, you have to pull the design team in, generally as a whole, to solve that problem. Well, that's not a big deal if you've got 3 or 4 different models, but if you've got 12 different models or 20 different models, and you start having breakdowns, you know, because you're producing them like at roughly the same time, all of a sudden your design team becomes the bottleneck on being able to resolve that. And so realizing they need to constrain the designs to work with marketing to get it into a reasonable portfolio was another surprise. And so there were others, but those are just 2 quick ones, and I don't want to chew up too much more time, but we were all surprised by that. Yeah.
Well, it does seem like it's a way to actually have people understand. Like, I think in a lot of times in organizations, you know, going back to the very beginning, sales and operations just point fingers at one another, right? Like, well, if you would just do your part better, if you would just do your part better. And this example, I think, highlights, well, there's actually work for everybody to do, right? Like there's actually, and here's actually where you sort of can start to find where those differences might lie, as opposed to it's your fault or my fault or shipping's fault or sales's fault. Cal, what were you going to add?
Well, I was just, we have an interesting question in the chat I wanted to just throw into the mix at this point. When people have apparently conflicting perspectives, how does the graphic depiction of those views help people learn from rather than argue with the differences? Scott.
Oh, that's lovely. Because that does come up. If we're doing our job well, it comes up. What's beautiful about that is I'll put forward what seems to be, well, what makes mathematical sense, you know, like in like these things seem like they would cause that based on everybody I've talked to. And then we actually leave it to the group to resolve, because, you know, we're not experts in whatever they do. So we'll put forward and sometimes I'll leave it on a map. I've even gone in and just put a question mark. It's like, they say this, this, and this causes this, but there's got to be something else. And I don't know what it is. So here's a question mark. And then they'll begin to have a conversation about it, and they'll go back and forth, and they're actually learning from each other, and they're weighing the, you know, the merits of each different party in the conversation's perspectives. And what's delightful about it is that there is a physical reality. And that physical reality, as they get closer and closer and closer to how does that really work down on the, you know, on the manufacturing floor, or, you know, in the logistics space, or wherever it is, they get to a place of alignment. And I know that probably isn't a very, they get to a place of, I almost want to say consensus, even though I never go for consensus because of the veto power implicit, but they arrive at a state of alignment and agreement about how reality functions. And it happens again and again and again. I mean, even with the guerrillas in the military in Guatemala, they got to places where they agreed, this is how society is functioning. And so even among, you know, I've done it with, in highly charged situations where reality emerges. Yeah. With one caveat. as a function of the quality of the conversation. So we have to manage the quality of the conversation, which again is why, working with Conversant's been such a beautiful thing.
Right, because if people aren't actually revealing sort of what's actually in their thinking, you're not going to get to the heart of the issues in the with the map, right? It's like any technology; it's only as good as what's entered into it, right? And so if people are not clear and really getting to the heart of their own thinking, and sometimes that takes some self-reflection to understand, like, well, what is my thinking, not my habituated, well, what's behind that and what's behind that. So I love that this process actually, and it's why even when you do sort of a map with just one person, it's like, oh, actually you're right, that is how I think about this challenge, and I didn't realize that I've had some other underlying thoughts or assumptions that are driving my behavior. So I think there's some real beauty in that.
I'll add one other quick thing, if I may.
Yeah.
I've even had to work with sociopaths, not like a whole group of them, thank God, but one person in the
You're
group.
not talking about us, right? Just checking. Okay, good. Sorry.
Damn, there goes my remark. No, but what's beautiful about that is the group, just like in Franz de Waal's work around primatology and ethology, the group actually puts that individual in check. And that individual actually it responds to the group pressure around, whoa, that seems kind of out of bounds there. That seems unreasonable, or that doesn't seem like it's true. And that person will begin to engage in all these appeasement mechanisms that you see, in the primate world. It doesn't cure them, but the group begins to assume, because now they have a shared view, they become powerful enough that they can operate even in the face of, attempted disruptions. And that's too has recurred several times. So that's probably a more direct answer to what do you do when one person is kind of off the wall.
Scott, just in the time that we have left, I'm going to give you a challenge, see if you can answer this question in a sentence or two, which is, it's a big question. I don't think we're ever going to get away from the chaos, volatility, unpredictability that we experience in the world today. I know people would love for it to be much more steady state. I think that's unlikely, right? So how do we help organizations or people in organizations, in your mind, be more resilient in the face of chaos? Because I think getting from chaos to clarity, the answer is not going to be get rid of the chaos, right? So how do we help people to be more resilient in the face of chaos?
Okay, so in two sentences. One, distinguishing between internal strategy and external strategy. So internal strategy, to go back to the body metaphor, would be, how am I training myself for my competitions? Okay. External strategy would be, who am I facing in my competitions? And that varies all the time. So constituting myself into my, what is my ideal state relative to my purpose, then once I've done that sufficiently, it frees me to deal with the dynamic of what's going to present itself to me. So it's almost like, start with the self, start with the organization itself.
Great. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. We could talk about this for hours, and actually have internally. So Scott and Kell, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody else, thank you for joining us. Bramble Kipple, it's nice to see you here. And thanks to everybody else who's joined us today. Kell's dropped into the chat how to connect with us via the newsletter. We will host another conversation in 6 weeks or so, so stay tuned for that. Scott, Kell, anything else you want to say as we say goodbye to everybody today?
Just, it's been a pleasure. I always enjoy talking about this because most people don't think it's possible still. So
great. Great.
Great. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Take
Bye,
care.
all. Have a great
Bye.
rest of your day.